Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the Middle Ages, but forget knights and castles. This isn't that story. We're here for the other side, the dirty side, the side that wore no armor, held no sword, and probably got yelled at by everyone, including the rats. Because while some people were writing poetry and jousting for love, others were ankle-deep in sewage. Literally. But before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, especially if you enjoy your history with a whiff of horror and a bucket of filth. And in the comments tell me, could you survive one day as a medieval gong farmer, or would you tap out at the first bucket? So, dim the lights. Get cozy, maybe hold your nose. We're about to journey through the worst jobs in medieval history. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Gong Farmer, the original waste management. If your job ever stinks, take comfort. At least it's not this. The gong farmer was responsible for removing human waste from cesspits and privies. They worked at night by candlelight, knee-deep in centuries of bad decisions and undigested regrets. Their tools? Buckets, shovels, and a spiritual detachment forged in filth. The name gong came from the Old English word gang, meaning to go. As in, when you go, someone has to deal with the aftermath. That someone was a gong farmer. They climbed into pits full of human waste and shoveled it out by hand into barrels. Barrels they carried, through alleys, uphill, in the rain, with no deodorant. Some cesspits were decades old. Imagine the layers, the textures, the legacy, their uniform, thick boots, leather gloves, and an overwhelming sense of purpose, or maybe just despair. Scented oils were out of reach. A strong stomach was not optional. They were paid relatively well, because no one else wanted to do it. In some cities it was one of the best paid manual jobs, but no matter the coin, they lived outside the town walls, shunned for their smell, feared for their uncleanness. They were necessary, but not welcomed. They often worked alone. Just you, the moonlight, and the quiet, squelching symphony of your career. And the worst part? They had to haul the waste out of town and dump it in pits or fields, far away, carrying barrels of medieval humanity's worst moments. Sometimes they had to remove waste from under wooden latrines attached to inns or tenements, meaning the sewage was still warm. Fun fact: in London, the term night soil was used to describe the product of their labor. It sounds poetic until you remember what it actually was. So, next time your inbox is full or your coffee's cold, remember the gong farmer. Because medieval burnout was literal, and it came in buckets. Chapter 2. Tanners, living in stink for leather. Now, if you thought the gong farmer had it bad, let me introduce you to the tanner. Someone whose job was to turn dead animal skin into something wearable, using methods that would make your eyes water and your ancestors cry. Tanners worked with hides, and turning hides into leather wasn't exactly a spa day for anyone involved. First, the skins had to be soaked to remove all the hair and flesh. They were soaked in a delightful mixture of water, lime, and, you guessed it, urine. Sometimes even dog poop, and not just any poop. White dog dung was prized for its softening properties. Who figured that out? We don't ask. And then, the tanner would scrape, pound, and stretch the hide for hours. Outdoors, in the sun, with flies and buckets of biological sludge. The stench clung to them like a second skin, except it smelled worse than the first. Their workplace was always downwind. Town councils literally banned tanneries from city centers because the stench was so powerful it could be used to repel Viking invasions. Probably. The smell was more than just bad. It was permanent. tanner families were often shunned. No one wanted to marry into a profession where your handshake alone could peel paint, but leather was essential. For boots, armor, saddles, scrolls, everyone wanted it. They just didn't want to know where it came from. The job required physical strength, chemical resilience, and an indifference to flies setting up shop in your hair. It wasn't glamorous, but it was skilled. The process of tanning could take weeks, with multiple soaks, stretches, and drying phases. Modern comparison. Imagine doing your laundry in a chemical plant that smells like compost and sounds like medieval dubstep. Now, do that barefoot, shirtless, and judged by your entire village. And like gong farmers, tanners were tolerated but never celebrated. Their job was vital, but their social life was limited. So, the next time someone brags about their artisanal leather bag, remember, that bag's great-great-grandfather was scraped clean in a field full of flies by someone with no social standing and very, very strong hands. Chapter 3, Leech Collector, Suck It Up. Let's talk about blood. Specifically, the kind that medieval doctors believed needed to be drained regularly to keep you balanced, healthy, and slightly anemic. Enter the leech collector. This brave, or deeply unfortunate, individual had one job: wading into ponds, marshes, and swamps to gather leeches. By hand. With their legs. Yes, the standard method of collection was to wade bare-legged into the muck, stand very still, and let the leeches attach themselves. Once enough had latched on and begun their vampire cosplay, the collector would pluck them off, drop them into jars, and sell them to physicians and barbers. Sometimes, if they were lucky, collectors used animals like old horses or livestock to attract the leeches instead. But that wasn't always an option, and a good leech collector needed to bleed for their paycheck. Quite literally. Risks included infections, blood loss, leech-borne diseases, trench foot, and the eternal psychological damage of standing in a swamp at 5 a.m. while slowly being drained by worms. And yet, leeches were in high demand. Everyone wanted them. For headaches, fevers, sore throats, marital problems, probably. Leeching was believed to balance the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, because what better way to cure a cough than a half-pint bloodletting? And collectors? They were often women, often poor, often sick themselves. Some came from families of collectors, passing down both their trade and their open wounds. Fun fact: leeches were so profitable in the 12th century that certain swamps were claimed as leech commons, and fights broke out over the best sucking spots. So, if you've ever walked into a Monday morning meeting and felt drained, imagine showing up literally bleeding, clutching a jar of squirming leeches, and hoping someone thought you looked professional. Because in medieval times, sucking up to the boss might have meant delivering the tools to suck out his blood. Chapter 4. Plague Doctor, Looking the Part, Dying Anyway. If there was ever a medieval job that combined high fashion, impossible expectations, and horrifying daily tasks, it was this one. The plague doctor, part healer, part undertaker, part grim reaper cosplay. We all know the look: long cloak, beaked mask, wide-brimmed hat. It's dramatic, iconic, slightly terrifying. But the reality, less glamorous, more fatal. Plague doctors were hired by cities to treat victims of the Black Death. Their uniform, the famous beaked mask, was filled with herbs, spices, and dried flowers to filter out the bad air. They believed disease spread through foul smells, not bacteria. Spoiler, it didn't work. Though the science was wrong, the outfit accidentally discouraged close contact. So, in a weird, bird-masked way, it might have helped a little. Doctors stuffed their masks with lavender, mint, camphor, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges. They carried a stick to poke and examine patients from a distance, and occasionally beat back desperate mobs. The cloak? Waxed leather to stop infection from seeping in. In theory, their tasks included lancing buboes, draining infected wounds, burning contaminated clothing, and occasionally recording the last words of the dying, if they could talk at all. Most couldn't. Many screamed. Some didn't make it past the door. Plague doctors didn't operate in clean hospitals. They worked in alleys, peasant huts, crowded tenements. Their waiting rooms were cobblestone streets slick with grief. Their stethoscopes, their ears, their tools, whatever didn't break under pressure. They were paid by the city, not the patient. So even if you were too poor to bribe a barber surgeon, you got a visit from a masked man with a stick and a bag of dried rosemary. Comforting. But being a plague doctor wasn't noble. It wasn't heroic. It was often a death sentence. Many doctors died. Those who didn't were feared, distrusted, or treated like portable omens. Children cried. Adults crossed the street. Some refused to open their doors. Imagine walking down the street and people closing their shutters because you were there. The medieval equivalent of clearing out the lunchroom by accident. Fun fact: some plague doctors carried death registers to track fatalities. Others just kept mental tallies. Either way, you were basically working HR for hell. So, next time someone in customer service says their job is soul-crushing, remember the plague doctor. He wore a bird mask, got paid in town tokens, and spent his days elbow-deep in pus. Chapter 5. Fuller, beating wool in urine. Ever heard of the phrase, "don't quit your day job"? Well, if your day job was being a fuller, you probably considered it. Every day. Fullers were the unsung heroes of medieval cloth production, tasked with cleaning, softening, and thickening woolen fabric so it didn't fall apart the moment you sneezed in its direction. Their secret weapon? Urine. Buckets and buckets of it. The process started by soaking raw wool in vats of stale urine, because ammonia is a natural cleanser, kind of brilliant, kind of horrifying. Collecting the urine often meant asking neighbors to contribute. Yes, some towns had designated piss pots for public donation. And then the fun began. The fuller would climb into the vat and stomp on the wool, with their bare feet, for hours. It was less of a job, more of a pea-soaked workout. If you ever wanted a career that combined textiles and trench foot, this was it. The wool had to be walked, punched, or clubbed until it was just the right texture. Too much, it matted. Too little, it stayed scratchy. The fuller's feet were their tools, their livelihood, and likely a public health hazard. The smell? Monstrous. Their homes were downwind, their clothes stained, their fingernails ruined, and you could smell them coming before you ever saw the wool. The job was also incredibly physical. Stomping wool in a vat of urine might sound gross, because it was, but it was also exhausting. Fullers worked barefoot, bent over, breathing in vaporized ammonia like a budget chemist. No ventilation, no protection, no gratitude. Fun fact: Fuller's earth, a type of clay used later for cleansing, got its name from this profession. So, technically, they were doing skincare before it was cool. But the job was important. Cloth was valuable. A good tunic meant comfort. A bad one meant endless itching and public ridicule. Monks needed robes. Nobles needed velvet. Even peasants needed something that didn't fall apart after 2 rainstorms. So the fuller walked. In circles. In piss. until fashion was achieved. And that's what medieval tailoring really looked like. So next time your laundry detergent spills and you think your day is ruined, remember the fuller. His detergent came in chamber pots. Chapter 6. Executioner, Job Security with a Side of Shame. Let's say you were good with an axe. Not great, not knight level, but decent. Now imagine someone offered you a career where you could use that skill, earn a stable income, and never get invited to dinner again. Welcome to the life of a medieval executioner. Executioners had one job: kill people, cleanly, publicly, and hopefully on the first try. Heads, limbs, hangings, burnings, you name it, they did it. But the pay, surprisingly solid. They were often given housing, land, or tax exemptions. Some were allowed to keep the clothes or belongings of the condemned. Others were tipped by spectators to end it quickly, or draw it out. A gruesome version of performance-based bonuses. Sounds like a sweet gig, right? Except everyone hated you. You were a pariah, touched by death. People wouldn't shake your hand. Children were told to avoid you. Priests debated whether your soul was already doomed. And if you messed up, like, say, needed more than one swing, people booed, threw things, sometimes rioted. Your workplace was a wooden scaffold. Your tools, axes, ropes, firewood. Your dress code, dark, intimidating, blood-resistant. And the pressure? Immense. A bad execution could spark unrest. A good one was barely acknowledged. You were the blunt instrument of justice, the final act in a legal drama no one wanted to star in. Executioners also handled torture, extracting confessions, demonstrating state power, or just putting on a show. Their job was part punishment, part theater. Public punishment had to look like justice. Fun fact, some executioners doubled as healers. Why? Because they were skilled with knives and anatomy. Irony, thy name is medieval job overlap. Some executioners became famous, others infamous. But nearly all were alone. Their job required precision, detachment, and zero emotion, unless you count the stomach-churning guilt that came at night, or the noise, or the smell, or the nightmares. So while they were feared, they were also used, needed, until they weren't. Because one bad swing, one botched execution, and suddenly the mob that once watched becomes the one that turns. So next time you feel isolated at work, just be glad your performance review doesn't include the phrase, crowd reaction to decapitation. Chapter 7. Rat Catcher, Pest Control Without Gloves. Let's talk rats. The fuzzy, plague-spreading nightmares of the medieval world. Wherever there were people, there were rats. In barns, bakeries, bedrooms, bell towers, rats ruled the streets, and it was someone's job to stop them. That someone was the rat catcher. Armed with traps, poison, terriers, or just raw determination, the rat catcher ventured into infested homes, pantries, sewers, and stables to hunt vermin. Sometimes solo, sometimes with a dog. Always with the knowledge that a missed rat could mean plague by Thursday. The work was constant, filthy, and deeply thankless. Catch too few rats. People died. Catch too many. Everyone remembered what you smelled like. Rats carried fleas, which carried Yersinia pestis, a name that still haunts epidemiologists. And yet, for all the danger they brought, rats were fast, clever, and very good at hiding under floorboards, behind tapestries, and sometimes in your dinner. Rat catchers developed a sixth sense for movement, a sound in the wall, a squeak under a stool, a ripple in the hay. That was their domain. A seasoned catcher could tell how many rats were in a room by smell alone, a gift that came with a lifetime of regret. Many carried pouches of herbs or vinegar-soaked cloths to counteract the smell. Some even wore masks or smeared their faces with oil to deter fleas. But mostly, they just suffered and hoped the rats didn't get bold. The most ambitious rat catchers boasted of their skills at fairs, performing live demonstrations or selling their secret rat poisons, many of which were about as effective as shouting. Some used live ferrets. Some used smoke. Some just kicked hay bales and prayed. And some were frauds. The worst catchers would release a few rats before their miraculous capture, just to impress the client. A medieval pest control hustle with a high risk of immediate reinfestation. Fun fact: in larger towns, the rat catcher might double as a public health informant. If he saw too many rats in one district, he knew plague was coming. But most were just trying to stay ahead of the infestation. So, if you think your office has a rodent problem, imagine crouching in a hayloft with a sack, a stick, and nothing but your instincts, and the overwhelming fear that what's scurrying towards you might be carrying your early retirement, because in medieval pest control, there were no gloves, just grit. Chapter 8. Resurrectionist, Grave Robbing for Science. Let's say you're a medical student in the 14th century. You need to study anatomy. You want to know what's inside the human body. Problem is, you're not legally allowed to dissect one. Enter the resurrectionist. These were people who dug up freshly buried bodies and sold them to medical schools, universities, or surgeons with enough coin and not enough scruples. The job required nerve, a shovel, and excellent night vision. You waited until burial was complete, sometimes just hours after the funeral, then came back under the cover of darkness. Quiet, quick, unwelcome. The goal was speed. Get in, dig just enough to reach the torso, drag the body out. You didn't need the whole coffin, just the parts someone would pay for. Some removed heads, others just limbs. Whatever fit into a sack or didn't arouse too much suspicion. There were no protective gloves, no formaldehyde, just cold, stiff limbs, and the constant fear that a local priest or grieving family member might catch you in the act. If they did, you could be jailed, fined, beaten, or worse, end up as the next dissection subject yourself. The irony writes itself. Some resurrectionists were medical students. Others were poor men trying to make coin the only way the black market allowed. Some were employed by the very doctors who claimed to abhor the practice in public. Others were night watchmen with a side hustle. And the irony? Many of the cadavers they stole were from paupers' graves, people too poor to live comfortably and now too dead to rest in peace. No headstone, no protection. Just 6 feet of dirt and a future in anatomy class. Fun. Fact: resurrectionists sometimes disguised themselves as mourners to scope out fresh graves. Others bribed cemetery caretakers or dug fake graves to confuse law enforcement. But thanks to them, anatomy progressed. Doctors learned, science advanced, and a generation of healers got their education by candlelight, over stolen corpses. So, next time you get frustrated with school, remember, at least you didn't have to dig up your textbooks. Chapter 9. Lime Burner, Cooking Rocks, Breathing Fire. Let's say you enjoy hard labor, open flames, and inhaling toxic dust for 12 hours a day. Congratulations, you might make a fine lime burner. Lime burning was the process of converting limestone into quicklime, a crucial ingredient in mortar, plaster, and whitewash. Without it, there would be no cathedrals, no castles, no paint on your walls. Civilization rested on the shoulders of men who shoveled rocks into giant ovens and hoped they didn't die. Here's how it worked. Massive stone kilns were loaded with limestone and fired at blistering temperatures, around 900 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to boil your patience and melt your eyebrows. The heat had to be maintained for days, non-stop, through wind, rain, and the occasional local drunk wandering into the fire. The result? Quicklime. A powder so caustic it could blind you, burn your skin, or, if inhaled for too long, turn your lungs into a sad, chalky soup. And yes, quicklime could spontaneously combust if mishandled or exposed to water. That's right. It burns hotter after you add water. Lime burners didn't wear masks, or gloves, or anything OSHA would remotely approve of. Their protective gear was a damp rag over the mouth and an acceptance of fate. They worked in isolation, often in rural areas where the only company was soot, ash, and the occasional terrified apprentice. Meals were eaten with dirty hands. Sleep was taken in shifts. Accidents were common. Explosions, collapses, or sudden lime flashes that left skin permanently damaged. Despite this, lime was in constant demand. It was used to build roads, line wells, treat soil, and plaster the walls of monasteries and mansions alike. Without lime, the medieval world fell apart, sometimes literally. Fun fact, quicklime was also used in some medieval burial rituals to purify the corpse. Imagine working a job where your product had both sacred and septic applications. So the next time you walk past a historic stone building and admire its craftsmanship, spare a thought for the guy whose eyebrows fueled the mortar. Because in medieval industry, there was no glory in fire. Just sweat, soot, and survival. Chapter 10. Tooth Drawer. Dentist without training. If you've ever dreaded a dental appointment, be thankful you weren't alive in medieval times. Because dentistry back then wasn't a profession, it was a public spectacle. Enter the tooth drawer. These folks weren't trained, they weren't licensed, many weren't even sober. But they had one skill: yanking teeth out of screaming people at markets and fairs, usually with a pair of iron pliers and a dramatic flair. You'd find them beneath a colorful banner, maybe shouting about their miracle cure for all ills. A drum might be playing. A crowd would gather. And then someone, usually desperate and in agony, would climb onto a stool and open wide. The tooth drawer didn't use anesthesia. He didn't use gloves. He rarely washed his tools. He grabbed the offending molar and pulled. And if it didn't come out the first time, he pulled harder. Sometimes he removed the wrong tooth. Sometimes several teeth. Occasionally a chunk of jawbone. But the important thing was, you stopped complaining about your toothache, because now you were unconscious. Tooth drawers were also showmen. They'd wave your bloody tooth like a trophy. They might hand out a charm or a miracle tonic to ward off future pain. They loved applause. They were part dentist, part butcher, part hype man. In some towns, barbers doubled as tooth drawers. You could get a shave, a haircut, and your molars realigned all in one visit. Multitasking at its most horrifying. And the worst part? They were popular. People lined up. Because pain was constant and options were few. You either lived with it or risked having your teeth yanked out with garden tools. Fun fact, some tooth drawers used a tooth key, a metal crank that rotated the tooth out of the socket. Precision dentistry? Number effective? Occasionally. So, the next time you're sitting in a reclining chair with numbing gel and gentle music, say a silent thank you to modern dentistry. Because once upon a time, tooth care was a blood sport. Chapter 11. Woad dyer, all blue, all the time. Fashion is pain. But in the case of the medieval woad dyer, fashion was also fermentation, foul odors, and staining your skin for weeks on end. Woad is a plant that produces a rich blue dye, the same pigment used to color clothing for nobles, banners for kings, and occasionally war paint for battle-hardened Celts. To extract that beautiful blue, you had to ferment the woad leaves in urine, human urine, for days, sometimes weeks. This wasn't optional. It was chemistry, disgusting, splashy chemistry. The process required vats of warm, sloshy, fermenting woad pea. Once the leaves were steeped and stirred, often with bare hands, the liquid was left to oxidize. That's when it turned from greenish-yellow to glorious indigo. The smell. Unholy. Worse than a tanner's yard. Worse than a pigsty in August. So bad that neighbors petitioned to have dyers relocated far from town, preferably to another country. And the work was relentless. Dyers stirred the vats, wrung the cloth, hung it to dry, and repeated the process until the color stuck. Their hands, arms, and faces often turned blue and stayed that way for days. Blue-stained skin wasn't fashionable. It was occupational branding. You could tell a woad dyer from a mile away, assuming the wind was in your favor. Despite the grime and stink, woad dyers were respected for their skill. Achieving the right shade was an art. Too little oxidation, muddy green, too much, streaky disaster. The perfect blue was a balance of timing, temperature, and olfactory sacrifice. Fun fact: woad dyeing was so important that English laws were passed to protect the industry. Blue cloth meant business, so the next time you throw on your favorite indigo hoodie or swipe on blue eyeliner, remember, someone, somewhere, once stirred a urine pot with their bare hands so you could look fabulous. Because in medieval color theory, beauty came in shades of suffering. Chapter 12. Sin Eater. Your soul is my supper. Imagine being the last person invited to dinner because everyone else is dead. Enter the Sin Eater, a person paid to absorb the sins of the recently deceased by literally eating food placed on their corpse. The tradition went something like this. Someone dies. Their family places a bit of bread or cake on the chest of the body. The Sin Eater is called in. He arrives, mutters a prayer or charm, eats the food, drinks some ale, and walks away, spiritually bloated with the sins of the departed. To the living, it was a way of clearing a loved one's soul before burial. To the Sin Eater, it was dinner and a spiritual dumping ground. They were seen as necessary. They were also feared. After all, this was someone who trafficked in sins, touched corpses, consorted with death. Some believed sin eaters aged faster, suffered strange illnesses, or carried the weight of dozens of condemned souls. They were rarely thanked, often paid in pennies or food, never welcomed into polite society. Children were warned not to make eye contact with them. Church officials condemned the practice, but it persisted, especially in rural areas where theology took a back seat to practicality. And despite the eerie vibes, sin eaters performed a psychological service. They gave the grieving something to hold on to, a ritual, a sense of closure, a scapegoat, sanctified by supper. Fun fact, the last recorded sin eater in England died in the early 1900s. So, yes, this tradition lasted disturbingly long. But at what cost? Some sin eaters reportedly lived alone, isolated, surrounded by talismans and odd pets. Others kept detailed journals of the names and deeds of the souls they consumed, like grim spiritual accountants. So the next time you complain about your job being soul-sucking, remember, at least you didn't have to wash down someone's eternal sins with cold ale and a dry crust of bread. Because in the medieval afterlife industry, someone had to eat the sins. Chapter 13. Alewife, Brewing Trouble. Before corporate breweries, microbrews, and craft IPA influencers with beards and spreadsheets, there was the alewife, the medieval woman who brewed, sold, and quite possibly saved her community one pint at a time. Ale was essential. It wasn't just for parties, it was safer than water. Wells were often contaminated with waste or disease, but fermented grain, that was survival. It had low alcohol, was calorie-rich, and children drank it too. This wasn't binge drinking. This was breakfast. And in many towns it was women, not men, who ran the brewing, usually from their homes. The alewife was brewer, marketer, chemist, and bartender in one smoke-stained apron. The recipe was simple: barley, water, and yeast when she had it. Herbs and flavorings were added for variety, sometimes nettles, rosemary, or elderflower. She boiled it in cauldrons, stirred with wooden paddles, and cooled it in tubs. No thermometer, no timer, just instinct and an uncanny ability to smell when something was going wrong. She advertised with an ale stake, a pole outside the house with a bush tied to the end. If the stake was up, the ale was ready. If the stake was missing, either she was out or someone stole it during a bender. Her ale was thick, unfiltered, slightly cloudy, and came in whatever vessel was clean, or cleanish. And yet it was beloved. Workers bought it at dawn. Travelers stopped for a jug. Entire communities ran on her brew. Was she respected? Sometimes. If her ale was good and her reputation solid, she might be praised. But often she was suspected, because brewing in a smoky cauldron while muttering to yourself looked witchy. Too much success? Witch. Ale too strong? Witch. Unlucky mole on your arm? Definitely witch. Fun fact: some believe alewives may have inspired the modern image of a witch, with their tall hats for visibility, brooms for advertising ale, cauldrons for brewing, and cats for company. It's speculative, but suspiciously on brand. They were taxed, fined, accused, but they kept brewing. They fed their families, bought freedom, supported churches, and all while ducking rumors and boiling grain. So next time you sip a foamy craft brew and debate the notes of citrus and peppercorn, raise a toast to the alewives, because long before hops were trendy, beer was brewed by women in kitchens, with no goggles, no gloves, just guts and grain. Chapter 14. Spit Boy, Rotisserie Intern. If you think your entry-level job is thankless, allow me to introduce the Spit Boy, the human rotisserie operator of the medieval kitchen. He was the unsung hero of every banquet, feast, and slow-roasted animal sacrificed in the name of noble appetites. This poor soul, often a child or lowest-ranking servant, had one job: stand by the hearth and rotate the spit, for hours, while massive joints of meat sizzled, dripped, and smoked over an open flame. No breaks, no chair, no distractions, just rotation. You were the original slow cooker, except without a temperature setting or a lid, and you sweated profusely while turning mutton for a lord who wouldn't learn your name. Too fast, and the meat scorched. Too slow, and it stayed raw. Just right? Nobody noticed. Your job was like seasoning, essential but invisible. The heat was unbearable. Kitchens were brick ovens, no windows, just soot, grease, fire, and orders barked in 10 directions. If you fainted, someone kicked you, If you burned yourself, don't bleed on the goose. In larger households, spit boys were placed in turnspit wheels, literal hamster wheels mounted beside the fireplace. They ran inside to spin the spit. That's right. Medieval meat was sometimes cooked by child-powered treadmill. Sometimes the wheel was powered by a dog. Usually, it was powered by fear. And when the meat was finally done, no, you didn't eat. You scrubbed the floor, polished the cauldron, and started turning the next pig. Fun fact, the turnspit dog was so iconic it became its own breed, short-legged, long-bodied, and always running from dinner duty. So, if you ever find yourself doing repetitive work for no recognition while someone else enjoys the rewards, remember the spit boy. Because in medieval kitchens there was no such thing as entry level, there was only fire. Chapter 15. Messenger. Good news, bad roads. Think your morning commute is rough? Try being a medieval messenger. These folks had one job: get a message from point A to point B, ideally without being robbed, frozen, devoured by wolves, or executed as a spy. They rode horses, walked, or if the terrain was really awful, crawled through mud and snow. They carried scrolls in wax-sealed tubes, tucked into belts or saddlebags, and traveled across forests, battlefields, and plague-infested villages. No maps, no GPS, no weather report, just intuition, boots that leaked, and the last known directions shouted by a drunk monk outside a tavern. Messages could be political, romantic, or military. Each came with consequences. Deliver bad news to the wrong lord? Lose a hand, misread the script, start a war, show up late? Everyone's already dead. Messengers often carried multiple notes. Some were fake, decoys in case they were captured. Some were encrypted, written in code, rhyme, or the medieval equivalent of disappearing ink, smashed berries. Some were memorized entirely, in case the scroll was taken. So yes, they were walking hard drives. They were expected to remember spoken messages too, word for word. Deliver them to kings, nobles, or angry knights who'd lost their temper and their reading glasses. And yet, the pay was meager. The risk was high, and the weather was almost always terrible. Fun fact: trusted messengers were often chosen for their legs, not just speed, but durability. Some walked hundreds of miles a month and still had the energy to recite court gossip on arrival. So the next time your email won't send, or your boss says, "Can you just pop over and tell them?" remember the messenger. He crossed mountains with a scroll and a prayer. Chapter 16. Quarryman. Pickaxe, pray, repeat. Let's say you liked the outdoors, you liked breaking things, and you were fine with never standing up straight again. Congratulations, you might have made a fine medieval quarryman. Quarrymen were the backbone of medieval construction. Cathedrals, castles, monasteries, bridges, they all needed stone. And stone didn't arrive cut and stacked. It had to be pried, pounded, and hauled out of the side of a mountain by men with more grit than vertebrae. The work? Brutal. You started before sunrise, climbed into a pit with a pickaxe, and started chipping. You chipped for hours, days, months, sometimes years, for a single building. Quarrymen used hand tools, sledgehammers, wedges, chisels. No drills, no cranes, just sweat, leverage, and guesswork. Some blocks weighed hundreds of pounds, and once they were freed, you had to haul them to the surface with ropes, pulleys, and prayer. Dust? Everywhere, in your nose, eyes, lungs. Many developed chronic coughing, wheezing, and what we'd now call silicosis, stone lung. Some coughed dust until their last breath. And the noise, constant, echoing, deafening. Hammer on rock, shouts, the crack of stone splitting. It was a symphony of exhaustion. One mistake, a rock slide, one bad lift, a crushed foot, no insurance, no liability waivers. Just a shout, a prayer, and maybe a wooden cross hammered into the quarry wall the next day. Fun fact, some medieval quarrymen carved secret symbols into the stones they cut, part superstition, part signature. Their version of leaving a business card in a wall. And yet, there was pride. Every arch, every pillar, every cobblestone street was possible because of their work. Their sweat became structure, their pain, permanence. So the next time you admire medieval architecture, remember the guy in the pit. He didn't get a statue, he built one. Chapter 17. Watchman, the Human Burglar. Alarm. Before neighborhood apps, security cameras, or laser motion sensors, there was the medieval watchman, a lone figure with a lantern, a stick, and just enough courage to pretend he wasn't afraid of the dark. Watchmen patrolled towns and cities at night. Their job? Prevent crime, report fires, catch thieves, and stay conscious. They carried horns or bells to raise the alarm. Some were expected to call out the hour and the weather, midnight and all's well, unless of course it wasn't. Then it was midnight and something is on fire. The job required endurance. You walked for hours through crooked alleys, past shuttered homes, and across freezing town squares. If it rained, you got soaked. If it snowed, you kept walking. If you heard footsteps behind you, well, hopefully it was your partner, if you had one. Falling asleep on duty was a punishable offense. Sometimes it meant public shaming, sometimes flogging, sometimes just being replaced by someone with stronger coffee and fewer children. And when things went wrong, when a house caught fire or a brawl broke out at the inn, you were the first responder. Except your equipment was a bell and a stick. Your best defense was volume and optimism. Pay was inconsistent. Some towns paid in bread, others in coins, and a few in God bless you and don't get stabbed. You weren't quite law enforcement. More like an alarm system with anxiety. Fun fact. Some watchmen were also tasked with herding stray pigs and dogs off the streets at night. Nothing says civic pride like chasing a squealing hog through mud at 2 a.m. And let's not forget the loneliness. You walked alone. You listened to the wind, the creaking shutters, the occasional ghost story whispered by the wind. So the next time your home alarm system chirps and you sigh in annoyance, remember the medieval watchman. He climbed towers, chased goats, and risked his shins, all so you could sleep like nothing outside was on fire. Chapter 18. Hermit for Hire. Pray for us, please. Some people work in cubicles, others in kitchens. In the Middle Ages, you could be paid to work in isolation. Enter the hermit for hire. These weren't wild-eyed mystics living off moss and thunder, though some might have started that way. These were sanctioned holy men, or sometimes women, who lived alone, prayed constantly, and provided spiritual security for towns trying to boost their divine PR. Town councils, nobles, or religious institutions would sponsor a hermit to live in a cell or hut, often on the edge of town, beside a bridge, or even attached to a church wall. The idea? Their constant prayer and suffering kept the town safe, like a human firewall against bad luck and eternal damnation. Some hermits lived in anchor holds, tiny rooms with no exits, no furniture, just a small window for food and prayer requests. Others lived in wooded huts, caves, or cliffside nooks, their only companions. Dust, spiders, and possibly a mouse with theological questions. Their job? Pray, constantly, for harvests, for forgiveness, for victory in war, for that one guy who kept stealing apples and was clearly on thin ice with St. Peter. They were expected to be holy, humble, and helpful. They were also expected not to wander off, gamble, or use their cell as a wine cellar, all of which happened often enough to warrant official rules against it. Some hermits were revered. Villagers brought offerings, asked for blessings, whispered sins. Others were ignored, feared, or accused of being fake. "That guy's beard is too clean" was the medieval equivalent of a Yelp review. Fun fact: the church sometimes audited hermits to ensure they were sufficiently miserable. Yes, there were spiritual performance reviews, but for those truly devout or truly allergic to society, it was a calling. No screaming customers, no sword fights, no plague, just silence, soup, and a very ambitious spider living behind your altar. So the next time you daydream about quitting everything and living in a cabin in the woods, remember, in medieval times that job already existed, and someone was already doing it for less than minimum wage and a handful of beans. Chapter 19. Bell Ringer, The Toll of Time. Ding dong, time to lose your hearing. The medieval bell ringer had one job: announce the passing of time, call people to worship, signal public events, and alert the town to danger by hauling ropes connected to massive bronze bells, often bigger than the bell ringer himself. Church bells weren't dainty. Some weighed over a ton. The ropes were thick. The towers were tall. And the job was entirely manual. No electricity, no mechanics. Just your arms, your spine, and the hope that gravity didn't get creative today. To make a bell sing, you climbed into the belfry, sometimes through a stone spiral staircase, sometimes up a wooden ladder that had seen better centuries. Then you grabbed the rope, braced your feet, and pulled. Hard, repeatedly, rhythmically, with the sound echoing not just through the town, but through your teeth. It wasn't just tugging, it was technique. The rope whipped, coiled, snapped. Mistime a pull, and it could send you flying. Get your hand caught, that's a broken wrist. Get your foot tangled. Say goodbye to dignity and a few teeth. Inside the tower, deafening. Bell ringers often suffered permanent hearing loss, tinnitus, or migraines. There was no protection. Just you, your robe, and a tower full of birds that resented your work schedule. And it wasn't just Sundays. Bells rang for births, weddings, funerals, mass, market days, storms, royal visits, and, during pandemics, non-stop tolling for the dead. Some towns had codes: long tolls for fires, short peals for danger, urgent clangs for invasion. You weren't just ringing for fun, you were ringing the medieval equivalent of a news alert. Fun fact: bell ringing was considered a spiritual act. The sound was believed to drive away evil spirits, cleanse the air, and announce the presence of God. So, in addition to going deaf, you were also under constant pressure to save everyone's soul acoustically. Sometimes bell towers doubled as watchtowers, so bell ringers were expected to spot fires, armies, or apocalyptic horsemen between chimes. And don't forget the cold. Towers were drafty. In winter, you rang in gloves if you had them. Or not at all, if your fingers turned into frozen sausages. In summer, the heat rose, baking the bell ringer like a meat pie. Still, they showed up. Morning, noon, dusk. Some pulled bells in teams. Others worked alone. All were vital, all were loud, and none were remembered. So next time your phone alarm annoys you in the morning, remember the medieval bell ringer. He climbed a tower, braved the pigeons, and risked his eardrums just so you knew it was Tuesday. Chapter 20. Alchemist's Assistant, possibly exploding. Want to mix science, danger, and complete guesswork? Step right up. You're hired as an alchemist's assistant. Your job? Help a very serious and very eccentric man try to turn lead into gold, discover immortality, and maybe invent gunpowder, all in the same afternoon. The lab? Usually a dark stone room filled with smoke, suspicious stains, melted glassware, and books written in Latin, Arabic, Greek, or just completely made-up symbols. Bonus points if the shelves included jars with vague labels like essence of dragon's breath or vapor of Saturn. Your tools: fire, glassware, mystery powders, and nothing even resembling a safety manual. You'd spend your days grinding minerals, heating metals, distilling odd liquids, and occasionally setting your sleeve on fire. Alchemists were part scientist, part philosopher, part magician, and part delusional optimist. They wrote complex treatises about the philosopher's stone, a substance that could supposedly grant eternal life, infinite wealth, and zero regulatory oversight. And you, their assistant, did the grunt work, pumping bellows, adjusting flasks, watching for signs that the experiment was about to explode. If a beaker cracked, the spirit wasn't summoned, or the elixir turned green instead of gold, it was your fault. You didn't grind the bone dust fine enough. You stirred counterclockwise. You blinked wrong. Explosions? Common? Mercury fumes? Standard, Wednesday, of course. Occasionally, the entire lab was reduced to ash, and then you had to clean it up, with a straw broom and a 1,000-yard stare. Fun fact: alchemy was the forerunner to modern chemistry, but also astrology, pharmacology, and metaphysics. Some of their potions worked, most didn't. All were risky. Still, there was status. Working with an alchemist meant you were educated, or at least literate enough to mispronounce aqua regia. If you survived long enough, you might even publish your own book, 100 Ways Not to Die in a Lab. But most didn't. They coughed a lot, developed mysterious rashes, and started seeing stars in a non-metaphysical sense. So next time you hear about the magic of science, think of the alchemist's assistant, standing in the smoke, holding a bubbling flask, and wondering whether this was the path to enlightenment, or just another Tuesday explosion. Chapter 21. Chamberlain. Royal Duties, Questionable Privacy. If you've ever worked a job that made you question your dignity, just remember, somewhere in the Middle Ages, there was a man whose job was to carry a king's chamber pot. The chamberlain wasn't just a royal servant. He was the monarch's personal assistant, valet, bathroom attendant, closet organizer, scheduler, secret keeper, and emergency therapist, all in one. And no, he didn't get a crown for it. His daily routine included waking the king, dressing him, selecting his wardrobe, brushing his hair, preparing his bed, laying out his meals, and yes, managing the sovereign's natural cycles. The chamberlain handled the close stool, a sort of royal toilet throne, cleaned it, and occasionally wiped. He literally dealt with royal crap, and he did it with a bow. But here's the twist: chamberlains were often powerful, because while they handled some of the most demeaning tasks, they also had intimate access to the king. Sometimes more than the king's advisors, council, or even his family. In an age where privacy was rare, the chamberlain heard every muttered insult, every midnight groan, every argument behind closed curtains. He was there during love affairs, political scheming, hangovers, and digestive emergencies. And knowledge, as they say, was power. A clever chamberlain could rise through the ranks, become a confidant, influence decisions, and gain wealth or titles. Some even became lords or were knighted, proving that, yes, in medieval society, you really could clean your way to the top. But it wasn't all gossip and silver spoons. He also had to keep the king's secrets, or else. A single slip of the tongue, a misplaced garment, a delayed chamber pot, and suddenly you were out of favor, or worse, out of a job. And in medieval times, unemployed often meant starving, imprisoned, or mysteriously disappeared. And if the king was sick, you were bedside. If the king was traveling, you rode with him. If the king had gas, you were within range. It was a career of contradictions, prestigious yet humiliating, powerful yet precarious. So the next time you refill your boss's coffee or answer an awkward text, remember the chamberlain, the man who held a king's slippers in one hand and his secrets in the other. Because in the hierarchy of medieval labor, nothing said trusted employee, like knowing exactly how many prunes it took to ruin royal dinner. Chapter 22. Monastery. Scribe, ink, pain, and eternal Latin. If you've ever thought your office job was repetitive, imagine copying the same sentence for 12 hours a day while sitting in silence, freezing, and slowly losing your will to live. Welcome to the life of a medieval monastery scribe. Scribes were the monks responsible for preserving knowledge by writing it down, over and over and over, by hand, in Latin, with quill pens, on animal skin parchment. One mistake, and you might ruin a whole page that took a week to prepare. Make the same mistake twice, you might ruin your back, your sanity, or your salvation. They sat in cold stone scriptoria, the designated writing rooms of monasteries, usually without fires because fire near parchment was a terrible idea, especially when your entire building was made of flammable theology. So you wrote with numb fingers, bad light, and possibly the early stages of frostbite. The tools? A sharpened goose-feather quill, pots of ink made from soot and wine, or oak galls and iron salts, and parchment made from treated sheep or calf skins. Every material was expensive, every word precious, every sneeze a potential career-ending disaster. The work? Copying Bibles, psalters, homilies, occasionally classical texts that weren't too suspiciously pagan. You weren't encouraged to think, only to transcribe. You were the medieval equivalent of a printer, with scoliosis. Some monks added small, honest notes in the margins, now famous among historians. Like, "Oh, my hand. This page is so dull." Let the reader's voice be gentle and his hand clean. The parchment is hairy. Writing bores me. These margin mutterings are some of the only unfiltered glimpses we have into the internal lives of the scribes, men devoting their days to sacred work while quietly begging for a nap. And despite the tedium, their work mattered. They preserved the knowledge of ancient Rome and Greece, the scriptures of the Church, and the poems of forgotten kingdoms. Without scribes, history would have gone dark and stayed there. But the cost? High, chronic neck and back pain, infected blisters from quill cuts, ink stains that never faded, eyesight that gave out before your vows did, and all under a vow of silence, meaning you couldn't even complain aloud when your inkwell froze or the abbot dropped by to critique your lettering. Still, the work was considered noble, holy. Scribes were closer to God, they said, even if their backs were closer to collapsing. So the next time you type something, delete it, type it again, and complain about autocorrect. Remember the scribe. He couldn't delete, he couldn't speak, and he definitely couldn't stretch without getting excommunicated for heresy against the spine. Chapter 23. Castle latrine. Cleaner. thrones of despair. Ah, life in a castle. Elegant tapestries, roaring hearths, velvet cloaks, and the delicate perfume of human waste. Because for all their grandeur, medieval castles still had one inconvenient reality. Nobles pooped too, and someone had to clean it up. Enter the castle latrine cleaner, the unsung, unwashed hero of royal sanitation. Most castles were built with garderobes, vertical shafts built into the outer walls, often positioned high above a moat or a cesspit. These were the medieval version of indoor plumbing, more hole-in-the-wall than flushable luxury. The waste simply dropped down into pits below, which, shockingly, didn't clean themselves. And that's where the latrine cleaner came in. Armed with a bucket, a long-handled rake, and a pain tolerance unmatched in modern society, this poor soul had the task of descending, often quite literally, into the belly of the castle to remove years of aristocratic digestive expression. There were no gloves, no rubber boots, no ventilation, just ankle-deep filth, crumbling ladders, and the constant risk of slipping somewhere no man should ever slip. The smell? Medieval records don't do it justice. Think ammonia, rot, mildew, and shame, all fermenting in a stone room the size of a modern closet. And the hazards? Plenty. Toxic fumes from decomposing waste could cause unconsciousness or death. Bacteria-laced sludge could lead to infection. And occasionally, rats, big ones, the kind that didn't back down. Cleaners had to crawl into these pits with hand tools and scoop the waste into barrels, which then had to be dragged out and dumped somewhere far enough away not to offend the nobility. Often, this somewhere was a field, a river, or the nearest patch of land belonging to someone you didn't like. Some castles had multiple garderobes, especially if they hosted guests. Imagine cleaning up after a royal banquet for 30 nobles who'd each enjoyed 3 courses and 2 flagons of wine. It wasn't just messy, it was a logistical nightmare. And lest you think this job had no dignity, remember, someone had to maintain the health and hygiene of the castle. In their own way, the latrine cleaner protected the inhabitants from disease and decay. They were the sanitary backbone of feudal luxury. Were they paid well? Occasionally, mostly they were just paid enough. Enough to buy soap they could never use thoroughly, and food they had to eat with hands that never truly felt clean. And social status? Non-existent. They were invisible unless something went wrong. Much like modern IT professionals. So the next time you press a flush handle and walk away without thinking twice, spare a thought for the medieval latrine cleaner, the man who braved the moat's worst horrors with nothing but a rake, a bucket, and a very damaged sense of smell. Because when it came to royal thrones, someone had to serve the seat. Chapter 24. Medieval Midwife Screams Herbs and Hope. In an age before hospitals, epidurals, and fetal monitors, childbirth was one of the most terrifying and sacred events a person could experience, and at the center of it all stood the midwife. Forget sterilized delivery rooms and medical degrees. The medieval midwife relied on experience, instinct, and a pouch of herbs that smelled like hope and mossy linen. She was equal parts nurse, counselor, herbalist, and sometimes priest. Midwives attended births in homes, dark, cramped, and often chaotic. There were no gowns, no gloves, no prenatal checkups. Just a laboring mother surrounded by a gaggle of anxious relatives, and a midwife who had seen it all and knew how to keep a straight face while yelling for more hot water and clean cloth. Her job began long before the birth. Midwives brewed herbal tonics to encourage conception, offered fertility charms, and whispered advice laced with both folklore and centuries of hard-won knowledge. Think of her as a medieval doula with a side hustle in magical realism. Once labor began, she was on call, day or night, rain or snow. No candles, no problem. No clean bedding, improvise. No idea if the baby was coming out head first. Say a prayer, tighten your sleeves, and try anyway. The tools of her trade included swaddling cloth, sharp shears, warming stones, a basin of cold water, and a collection of dried herbs with questionable names like Mother's Root or Blessed Thistle. Sometimes she carried amulets for protection. Sometimes she carried a wooden spoon to bite down on, not for the mother, for herself. There was no anesthesia, no suction cups, no forceps unless you counted divine intervention. The only pain relief might be a leather strap to grip or a lullaby sung between contractions. That's if the woman wasn't already too hoarse from screaming. Complications were common: breech births, excessive bleeding, retained placenta. And if something went wrong, the midwife had to make a split-second decision: try something experimental or start praying harder. And the risks didn't end with delivery. Postpartum infections could be fatal. Newborns might not breathe. Mothers could collapse hours later. And through it all, the midwife stayed, cleaning, comforting, sometimes burying. The social status of a midwife was strangely paradoxical. On one hand, she was respected, even revered. People trusted her to guide life into the world. On the other hand, if the baby was born deformed, or the mother died, or lightning struck the chimney during delivery, she could be blamed, branded a witch, accused of consorting with demons. It didn't help that many midwives worked alone, muttered incantations, or used knowledge that priests didn't understand. That made her both powerful and suspicious. A woman who knew too much. Some cities tried to regulate midwifery, requiring licenses, oaths of morality, or supervision by male physicians. But most women in rural villages still turned to the local midwife, the same woman who had helped deliver their siblings, cousins, or even themselves. Because when labor began, there was no time for theology, just pain, panic, and the firm, calloused hands of a woman who had done this before. So the next time someone calls their job stressful, ask them if they've ever had to deliver twins by firelight, cut an umbilical cord with a kitchen knife, or be prepared to baptize a baby with spit because no one could reach the priest in time. Because in the medieval world, midwives didn't just bring life into the world, they wrestled it out of the dark. Chapter 25. Town crier. Yell the news, hope for tips. Before newspapers, before the printing press, before someone could shout at you on Twitter, someone shouted at you in person, loudly, with a bell. Enter the town crier, medieval public announcement system, human megaphone, and walking spoiler alert for everything from market prices to hangings. The town crier's job was simple in theory, but exhausting in practice. Take the latest royal decrees, church orders, town news, and officially sanctioned gossip. Then bellow it out in every major square, street corner, and muddy crossroad in town. Criers weren't just loud, they had to be memorably loud. You couldn't afford to mumble when you were announcing tax hikes or new plague curfews. Your voice had to rise above livestock bleating, merchant shouting, blacksmith hammering, and the occasional town drunk singing off-key in Latin. Most criers opened with the classic oyez, 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 derived from Old French meaning hear ye, or, more accurately, shut up and listen. Then came the news, delivered with flair, volume, and a complete disregard for indoor voices. The job wasn't just yelling, it was precise yelling. You had to recite royal orders word for word. Mess up a sentence, and you might accidentally declare war on the wrong country or tell the Butchers' Guild their tax has been doubled. Both were equally dangerous. And you couldn't pick and choose what you announced. You might go from "The King welcomes spring" to "Two thieves will be hanged at sunrise" to "Pigs are no longer allowed in the church vestibule." A full medieval news cycle, all screamed into the wind before lunch. Town criers had to walk long distances, often in bad weather, often in shoes that did not qualify as footwear. Rain? Yell through it. Snow? Don't slip on it. Fire? Announce it loudly, then run. Appearance mattered too. Criers wore bright, distinctive clothing, so people would recognize them as town officials and not just particularly confident lunatics. They often carried scrolls, badges, and most iconically, a handbell to draw attention. No bell, no one listens. They also had to deal with hecklers, thrown vegetables, impatient nobles, and people who pretended not to hear in hopes the news didn't apply to them. Despite the public role, criers didn't always enjoy high social standing. Some towns respected them. Others treated them like background noise with feet. Pay varied, sometimes a salary, sometimes tips, sometimes a hunk of bread and an awkward "good job." Fun fact: town criers were often protected by law. Hurting a crier while they were on duty was considered treason, a crime against the crown itself. That's right, you could publicly insult your neighbor, but not the man yelling about cabbage prices. But the job came with strange perks. Criers were among the first to know everything. Births, deaths, policy shifts, gossip. They were medieval information hubs with sore throats. In some cases, criers even took on extra duties, guiding visitors, collecting fines, helping illiterate citizens understand the law. So, the next time your phone pings with a push notification, or you roll your eyes at a town council announcement, remember, in the Middle Ages, someone walked a mile through mud to shout that news in your face, and rang a bell to make sure you heard it. Because before the algorithm, there was Alan the town crier, and he was always on. Final thoughts. Congratulations on not having these jobs. And there you have it. 25 of the worst, weirdest, most nose-wrinkling jobs that medieval history had to offer. From the sin-eater who dined on death, to the spit boy who cooked dinner while cooking himself, the Middle Ages were full of thankless roles performed by people who had very few choices, and even fewer safety standards. These weren't the knights or the nobles. These were the people in the shadows, in the mud, in the fire, in the outhouse. They didn't write poetry. They didn't commission stained glass windows. But they built the world the rest of us stood on. Progress was never clean. It came soaked in sweat, stained in blood, and sometimes carried out in buckets. And yes, their jobs were disgusting, dangerous, and spiritually exhausting, but they kept towns running, walls standing, and societies somewhat functioning. So the next time your barista spells your name wrong, or your Wi-Fi cuts out during a Zoom call, take a breath and remember. You're not ankle-deep in urine. You're not pulling teeth in the middle of a screaming marketplace. You're not churning plague air through a beak mask while holding a stick. You've got this. And maybe, just maybe, say a silent thank you to the gong farmer, the leech collector, and the blue-skinned woad dyer who walked so that we could not sleep tight. And may your dreams be free of tanners, rats, and slightly judgmental alchemists.